Open the door now, ma'am, or we will proceed without your cooperation. The voice cut clean through the still night air, amplified by a patrol car speaker that crackled just enough to make it feel colder than it was. Red and blue lights washed over the small, single-story home, flickering across white siding and the narrow front porch like a pulse that wouldn't slow down. Alicia Carter stood just inside the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the brass knob, her reflection faint in the glass pane beside it. 10 police cars. She counted them twice, not because she didn't believe it, but because her mind refused to accept that this was real. The gravel crunch of boots shifting outside carried through the wood, measured, controlled, practiced. She could hear radios murmuring, clipped codes passing between officers like a language built to exclude her. Alicia had just gotten home less than 20 minutes ago, her scrubs still creased from a 12-hour overnight shift at St. Mary's Medical Center, the faint scent of antiseptic still clinging to her sleeves. The clock on the wall behind her reads 6:42 a.m., the first hint of morning barely brushing the sky beyond the drawn curtains. And yet her quiet street looked like the center of an operation that had nothing to do with a nurse who spent her nights monitoring heart rates and changing 4 lines. She didn't move right away. Not out of fear, not exactly, but out of calculation. Her breathing stayed even, controlled, the same way she had learned to steady herself in emergency rooms when chaos tried to take over. Outside, Officer Daniel Briggs stood at the front of the formation, posture rigid, one hand resting near his belt, his gaze fixed on the door as if he had already decided what stood behind it. The others watched him, waiting for his next command, their silhouettes sharp against the flashing lights. Alicia could feel their assumptions pressing through the walls, heavy, predetermined. She reached for her phone slowly, deliberately, her fingers brushing the cool glass screen as it lit up in her hand. The number she tapped wasn't saved under a name. It didn't need to be. Her thumb hovered for just a second, not hesitating, just acknowledging the weight of what came next. Outside, the voice returned, sharper this time, less patient. Last warning, ma'am. The word ma'am landed without respect, just procedure. Alicia finally turned the knob, the latch clicking softly, a small sound swallowed by the hum of engines and radios. She opened the door just enough to step onto the porch, the morning air cool against her skin, the lights immediately catching her face, her eyes steady, unreadable. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step back. She simply looked at them, then at the line of cars stretching down her street, neighbors' curtains barely shifting in the distance. "You're at the wrong house," she said, her tone calm, grounded, as if she were stating a fact no one had bothered to check. Briggs took one step forward, boots landing firm on the concrete path, his expression unchanged. "We'll determine that," he replied. Alicia didn't argue. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the phone still in her hand, the call already connecting, the faint ring barely audible beneath the noise around her. She lifted it to her ear, her voice soft, almost lost in the morning air. "They're here." A pause. Then she listened, her posture straightening just slightly, something shifting beneath the surface, not fear, not defiance, but certainty. Outside, none of them noticed the change yet. Not in the way she stood, not in the way her shoulders settled, not in the quiet that seemed to gather around her despite the flashing lights. The street remained loud, controlled, authoritative, but something had already moved, unseen, set into motion the moment that call connected. The line stayed open against her ear, silent for a fraction longer than felt comfortable. But Alicia did not speak again. She did not need to, because she had already said everything that mattered. And somewhere miles away, a man who understood the weight of those 2 words was already moving. She could feel it in the stillness that settled into her chest. The same kind of stillness she relied on when a patient's monitor went from steady rhythm to something uncertain. Outside the house, the lights kept turning, red bleeding into blue across the cracked pavement and the trimmed hedges. Officer Briggs narrowed his eyes slightly as he watched her, not at the phone, not at the call, but at the absence of panic, at the way she stood there, as if this moment was not spiraling out of control, but locking into place exactly as she expected. "Who are you calling?" he asked, his voice controlled but edged now with something sharper, something closer to irritation than authority. Alicia lowered the phone just enough to glance at him, her expression unchanged, her voice calm in a way that did not invite further questions. "Someone who will know what this is," she said, and nothing about her tone sounded defensive. It sounded certain, and that certainty rippled outward in ways the officers did not fully understand yet. Behind Briggs, one of the younger officers shifted his weight, glancing at the others as if waiting for a cue that had not come. Radios continued their low chatter, but now it felt less coordinated, less confident, like a rhythm that had slipped half a beat off. Alicia stepped 1 inch forward onto the porch, not enough to challenge, just enough to ground herself. The wood beneath her shoes creaked softly, a small, ordinary sound in the middle of something that was no longer ordinary at all. She could feel the early morning air brushing against her skin, cool and steady, carrying the faint scent of damp grass and asphalt that had not yet warmed under the sun. Somewhere down the block, a car door opened and closed quickly. A neighbor who had stepped out and then thought better of it. The world was watching but pretending not to. Briggs took another step closer, stopping just short of the bottom stair. The distance between them now measured in feet instead of yards. "You need to put the phone down," he said, slower this time, each word placed carefully, like he was regaining control by force of tone alone. Alicia did not move. She lifted the phone back to her ear as if his instruction had not landed at all, her gaze drifting past him for just a moment, not searching, just observing, taking in the line of vehicles, the positioning, the way two of them had parked slightly angled as if anticipating movement that had never come. Details mattered. They always did, especially when something did not add up. Her voice dropped again, barely above a whisper, but steady enough to carry through the connection. "I am outside," she said, and then she listened, a longer pause this time, long enough that even Briggs noticed it, long enough that the silence itself began to press into the space between them, and then Alicia nodded once, small and precise, as if confirming instructions no one else could hear. "Understood," she replied, and that single word shifted something invisible. She lowered the phone slowly, not in surrender, not in compliance, but in completion, as if the action had already served its purpose. Her shoulders settled, her breathing evened further, and for the first time since the lights had flooded her home, Alicia Carter looked completely unbothered by the presence of 10 police cars surrounding her, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond this street, beyond this moment, and all that remained now was for everyone else to catch up to it. Officer Daniel Briggs had built his entire career on reading people in seconds, on deciding who complied and who resisted, who followed instructions and who needed to be managed, and everything about the woman standing on that porch unsettled that instinct in a way he could not immediately explain. Because Alicia Carter was not reacting the way situations like this were supposed to unfold. She was not raising her voice, not asking questions, not demanding explanations, and more importantly, she was not trying to prove anything. She was simply standing there as if the outcome did not depend on him at all, and that absence of urgency began to feel like something he could not control. He shifted his stance slightly, adjusting his footing on the walkway, the gravel crunching under his boots a little louder than before, and behind him one of the patrol car doors opened halfway then stopped. The officer inside hesitating as if waiting for direction that had not yet been given. Briggs exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Ma'am, we received a report tied to this address," he said, his tone formal now, leaning into procedure as if structure could re-establish authority. "So I am going to ask you one more time to cooperate and come down here so we can clear this up." Alicia listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed on him, not confrontational, just direct, and when he finished speaking there was a brief pause where the silence stretched long enough to feel intentional. "You should verify your report," she replied, her voice even, almost quiet, but it always carried. When someone was not trying to be heard, but simply stating something true, Briggs tightened his jaw slightly. That was not the answer he expected, not because it was defiant, but because it implied that the mistake was already his, and that implication landed heavier than any argument would have. One of the officers behind him murmured something into a radio, the words too low to catch, but the tone carried uncertainty. Alicia noticed it, not by looking, but by the way the air shifted, by the way the tension around her no longer pressed in one direction but began to scatter. She rested her free hand lightly against the doorframe, grounding herself again, her thumb brushing over a small scratch in the paint near the hinge, a detail she had seen 100 times before and never thought about until now. The ordinary detail anchoring her in a moment that felt anything but ordinary. Briggs took another step forward, stopping at the base of the porch, close enough now that the flashing lights reflected faintly in his eyes. "You made a call," he said, more statement than question. "Who exactly are we waiting on?" Alicia did not answer right away, not out of hesitation, but because the answer was already in motion and did not need to be explained. She tilted her head slightly, listening, not to him, not to the radios, but to something beyond the immediate noise, and then she spoke. "You will see," she said, simple, unembellished, and that simplicity carried more weight than any name she could have given. Behind Briggs, another officer turned toward the end of the street, his posture shifting subtly. Attention pulled outward, and for a brief moment the line of control that had been so tight began to loosen, not visibly, not in a way anyone could point to, but in the small hesitations, the glances, the way authority started to question itself without admitting it aloud. Alicia remained exactly where she was, the porch beneath her feet, the door at her back, the street in front of her no longer something closing in, but something waiting, and the difference between those two things was everything. The shift did not come with sirens or shouting. It came quietly, almost invisibly, starting at the far end of the street where one of the officers had turned his head just a moment too long, his posture tightening, as if something had entered his awareness before it reached anyone else. Alicia noticed it without moving, without even changing her expression, because she had already felt the moment coming from the second the call connected, the same way a nurse recognizes a change in a patient before the monitor confirms it. Subtle, undeniable, Briggs followed the direction of his officer's gaze, his eyes narrowing as he looked past the line of patrol cars toward the corner where the road curved out of sight. At first there was nothing but the quiet stretch of asphalt and the faint glow of early morning light beginning to soften the horizon, and then a low engine hum cut through the layered noise of idling cruisers, steady, controlled, not rushed, not aggressive, just present, the kind of sound that did not demand attention but earned it anyway. One of the officers instinctively reached for his radio, pausing mid-motion as if unsure whether to speak or wait, and that hesitation spread like a ripple, small but noticeable. Briggs straightened his shoulders, attempting to hold the structure together. "Stay focused," he said, his voice firm, but it lacked the certainty it carried minutes ago, because now there was something outside of his command entering the scene. Something not accounted for in whatever report had brought them here. The vehicle appeared slowly around the corner, a dark SUV, clean lines, no markings, no flashing lights, just a presence that moved through the line of patrol cars without urgency, as if it belonged there more than any of them did. It rolled forward and came to a smooth stop along the curb about 20 feet from Alicia's house, the engine cutting off with a quiet finality that seemed louder than the sirens had been. For a second no one moved, not the officers, not Briggs, not even the neighbors watching from behind half-drawn curtains. The door of the SUV opened, and Commander Marcus Reed stepped out, his posture relaxed but precise, every movement measured in a way that did not need to announce authority, because it carried it naturally. He wore no uniform that matched the officers, no badge that flashed in the light, but there was something about him that shifted the air immediately, a calm that replaced tension rather than adding to it. Alicia's gaze softened just slightly when she saw him. Not relief, not surprise, just recognition. As if this was exactly where the moment was always leading, Briggs took a step forward, intercepting the line between Reed and the porch. "Sir, this is an active situation," he began, defaulting to protocol, but Reed did not raise his voice, did not interrupt sharply. He simply looked at Briggs with a steady, unhurried focus that made the words trailing out of Briggs's sentence lose their footing. "Then you should explain why you are surrounding a registered address without confirmed verification," Reed said, his tone even, not confrontational, but precise, each word placed exactly where it needed to land. And suddenly the structure Briggs had been holding on to felt thinner, less certain, because this was not resistance. This was correction. One of the officers behind him shifted again, lowering his radio slowly, unsure now whether he was part of an operation or standing inside a mistake. Alicia remained on the porch, still, composed, the early light finally reaching the edge of her doorway, brushing against her face, and in that quiet shift from darkness to morning, the balance of the entire scene began to tilt, not through force, not through noise, but through the simple arrival of someone who already knew the truth. For a brief moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the space had shifted in a way that made every word feel heavier than before. Officer Briggs held his position at the base of the porch, but the certainty in his stance had begun to erode, replaced by something quieter, something closer to calculation. He glanced back over his shoulder at the line of officers behind him, expecting alignment, expecting confirmation, but instead he found hesitation, small, almost invisible, yet undeniable. Radios that had been active seconds ago now sat silent in gloved hands, shoulders that had been squared, now angled slightly inward, waiting rather than acting, and that waiting said more than any spoken doubt ever could. Commander Marcus Reed stepped forward just enough to close part of the distance, not aggressively, not as a challenge, but with the kind of calm precision that made it clear he did not need permission to be where he was. His eyes moved briefly from Briggs to the surrounding vehicles, taking in the positioning, the lack of perimeter coordination, the absence of visible warrant. Protocol, details that spoke louder than any explanation could. You said you received a report, Reed continued, his tone steady, measured. What report authorizes this level of response for a single resident without confirmation? Briggs opened his mouth to answer, but the words did not come as easily this time, because now the question was not rhetorical, it was specific, and specificity required clarity he did not fully have. We are following a call tied to this address, he replied. Finally, but the sentence sounded thinner now, less grounded, as if even he could hear the gap in it. Reed did not react with surprise or frustration. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. Then verify the origin of that call, he said, because right now you are acting on an assumption, not evidence. The distinction landed hard, not loudly, but with weight. One of the officers further down the line shifted again, this time stepping slightly back from his vehicle as if creating distance from something he no longer felt certain about. Alicia remained still on the porch, her presence quiet but unwavering. She had not moved since Reed arrived, had not needed to, because the scene was no longer pressing inward on her. It was unfolding outward, revealing itself piece by piece. She watched Briggs carefully, not with judgment, but with clarity, the kind that comes from seeing a situation exactly as it is without needing to react to it. Briggs exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip near his belt before letting his hand fall away entirely. A small gesture, but one that signaled a shift from control to reconsideration. He turned slightly toward one of his officers. Check dispatch again, he said, his voice lower now, more contained. The officer nodded quickly, lifting his radio, but there was a delay before he spoke, as if he needed a second to choose his words more carefully than before. The early morning light had grown stronger now, stretching across the street and catching the edges of the patrol cars, softening the harsh contrast of the flashing lights. The scene no longer felt like an operation. It felt like a question waiting to be answered. Reed glanced once toward Alicia, just briefly, and in that glance there was no urgency, no concern, just confirmation. She met his eyes for a second, then looked back toward Briggs, because the moment was no longer about her proving anything. It was about the truth finding its way through the noise. And as the officer on the radio finally spoke to dispatch, asking for verification that should have come before any of this began, the silence that followed carried more tension than the entire standoff had moments ago, because now everyone was waiting for the same thing, not orders, not commands, but the truth that would decide which side of this line they were actually standing on. The officer holding the radio finally spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of the confidence it carried earlier. Dispatch, confirm origin of the call tied to Alicia Carter's address. And then the line went quiet again, not empty, but heavy, filled with the faint static that now seemed louder than the sirens had been minutes ago. Everyone waited, not just for a response, but for clarity, for something solid to stand on. And in that waiting the entire scene slowed down, the flashing lights still turned but they no longer dominated the moment. The early morning sun had begun to stretch across the street, touching the tops of the patrol cars, softening the harsh edges of metal and glass. Alicia felt the warmth reach her shoulder, subtle but grounding. She inhaled slowly, the air no longer sharp with tension, but settling into something calmer, something closer to truth. Commander Marcus Reed remained still near the curb, his posture relaxed, his hands at his sides, not intervening, not pressing, just present, and that presence held more authority than any raised voice could have. Officer Briggs stood at the base of the porch, his focus now split between Alicia, Reed, and the radio that carried the answer he needed, the answer he should have had before any of this began. A faint crackle broke through the silence. Then a voice from dispatch came through, clear, procedural, unaware of the weight it carried. Unit requesting confirmation. There is no active warrant, no flagged report, and no emergency call logged for that address. The words landed without emphasis, but they changed everything. One officer shifted his stance immediately. Another lowered his radio completely, the subtle movements cascading through the line like a quiet unraveling. Briggs did not respond right away. His jaw tightened slightly as he processed what he had just heard, not because he did not understand it, but because it left no room for interpretation, no space to hold on to the version of events he had acted on. Alicia watched him, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just with clarity. The same clarity she had carried from the beginning, because she had never needed the answer to validate her position. She already knew it. Reed took one small step forward, closing the distance just enough to bring the moment into focus. Then this is a misidentification, he said, calm, direct, not accusatory, just precise. And it needs to be corrected immediately. Briggs exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the weight of authority shifting into responsibility. He turned halfway toward his officers, his voice no longer amplified by command, but grounded in correction. Stand down for now, he said. And though the words were simple, they carried a different kind of weight, one built on acknowledgement rather than control. The officers responded quickly this time, not out of urgency, but out of alignment. Radios lowered, postures eased. The perimeter that had been so rigid minutes ago began to open without needing to be ordered twice. Alicia remained on the porch, her hand still resting lightly against the doorframe. The house behind her quiet, unchanged, as if it had never been under pressure at all. She glanced once toward Reed, a brief exchange of understanding passing between them, and then back to Briggs, because this moment was not about who had arrived. It was about what had been revealed. The truth had not come in force. It had arrived quietly, through verification, through patience, through the simple act of asking the right question at the right time. And now that it was here, undeniable and steady, everything else had no choice but to adjust around it. The shift did not end with the dispatch confirmation. It deepened, unfolding in a way that made the earlier tension feel almost distant, like something that had belonged to a different version of this same morning. Officer Briggs stood still for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes fixed somewhere just past Alicia, as if he were replaying every step that had led him here. Measuring each assumption against the reality now standing in front of him, the quiet hum of engines idling began to fade. One by one as officers reached inside their vehicles to power them down, not on command, but on instinct, the urgency that had filled the street dissolving into something slower, something reflective. Alicia shifted her weight slightly, not retreating, not advancing, simply allowing the moment to breathe, the porch beneath her feet steady, familiar, grounding her in a space that had never actually changed. Even when everything around it had, Commander Marcus Reed turned his attention fully to Briggs now, his voice still even, but carrying a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. There is more to this than a misidentified address, he said, not raising the volume, but sharpening the precision. This call did not originate from here, and yet it directed a full response to this location. That is not a coincidence. The statement settled into the air with weight, drawing the attention of every officer within earshot. Briggs blinked once, the realization forming not as a sudden shock, but as a slow alignment of details he had not fully considered. You were saying this was intentional, he replied, quieter now. The question less defensive and more searching. Reed nodded once. I am saying Someone wanted you here, at this house, at this exact time. The implication spread through the line of officers like a second wave, heavier than the first, because this was no longer about a simple mistake. It was about being used without knowing it. Alicia listened carefully, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in fear, but in focus. Pieces of something larger beginning to connect in a way that made the situation feel less random and more deliberate. She stepped down one stair from the porch, closing a small portion of the distance, her voice steady as she spoke. Then they knew I would be here, she said, not asking, but confirming. Reed glanced at her briefly, acknowledging the point. They knew your schedule, he replied, or they knew enough to predict it. The words carried a quiet gravity, because they pointed to something beyond this street, beyond these officers, something that had been set in motion before any of them arrived. Briggs ran a hand briefly across his jaw, the weight of responsibility shifting again, now layered with the understanding that his presence here had not just been unnecessary, it had been part of someone else's design. He turned slightly toward his officers, his voice firm again, but this time grounded in correction rather than assumption. Pull all incoming call logs from the last hour, he instructed, and flag anything routed through secondary channels. The officers moved quickly, not out of urgency, but out of purpose, their actions now aligned with uncovering something rather than enforcing something. Alicia watched the shift, the way authority had transformed from pressure into investigation, and for the first time since the lights had flooded her home, there was a quiet sense of control returning, not because she had taken it, but because the truth had restored it. Reed stepped slightly to the side, giving space for the process to unfold, his presence no longer the focal point, but still the anchor that held the moment steady. The sun had risen higher now, casting a soft, even light across the street, replacing the harsh flashing colors with something clearer, something honest, and in that light, the entire scene revealed itself for what it truly was, not a confrontation, not a threat, but the beginning of an answer that had been hidden beneath layers of assumption, waiting to be seen. The movement became purposeful now, no longer reactive but directed, as officers began relaying information back and forth with a new level of care, their voices lower, more deliberate, the earlier confidence replaced by precision. One of them stepped closer to Briggs holding a tablet, the screen angled slightly upward, data streaming across it in neat lines that told a different story than the one that had brought them here. Sir, the call was routed through a relay server. It masked the origin, the officer said, his tone controlled but edged with realization. Briggs took the device, scanning quickly, his eyes moving left to right, pausing, then narrowing as the pattern became clear. This was not a random error. It was constructed. Reed watched quietly, giving the space for the understanding to settle without forcing it. Alicia stood one step down from her porch, her arms relaxed at her sides, but her focus sharpened, every word, every shift, every glance now part of a larger picture that was finally coming into focus. Briggs exhaled slowly and handed the tablet back, his voice firm again, but changed, grounded in accountability rather than assumption. Trace it, he said, find where it bounced from. I want the original source. The officer nodded immediately, stepping back and relaying the order, and this time the response moved through the line with clarity, not hesitation. As if the entire team had realigned around a single purpose, Reed stepped slightly closer, his presence still calm, but now more directly engaged. You were not sent here by accident, he said, his eyes briefly meeting Alicia's before returning to Briggs. Someone needed you here, needed this response, and they counted on you not questioning it. Briggs nodded once, the truth of that statement landing fully now. He looked toward Alicia, really looked this time, not as a subject of a call, not as a potential threat, but as someone who had been placed at the center of something she did not create. Ma'am, he said, the word carrying a different weight now, quieter, more respectful. This situation should not have happened. Alicia held his gaze, her expression steady, not softened, not hardened, simply present. But it did, she replied, not as an accusation, just as fact, and that fact lingered between them, not hostile, but undeniable. One of the officers called out from near the second vehicle. We have a partial origin, routed through a private network, but it links to an ongoing federal inquiry. The words pulled immediate attention. Briggs turned, stepping toward the voice. "What inquiry?" he asked, and before the officer could answer, Reed spoke, his tone even but unmistakably clear. "The one I am assigned to." The street fell into a different kind of silence then, not uncertain, but aware, the pieces aligning in a way that no longer left room for confusion. Alicia felt the shift as well, not as tension, but as understanding, the reason behind the call, the timing, the location, all of it, pointing towards something that had been unfolding long before this morning. Reed continued, his voice steady. This address was used to draw attention, to create a response, to test how quickly and how far a system could be moved without verification. Briggs absorbed the words, his posture straightening again, not in defense, but in recognition of the role he had unknowingly played. And now, Reed added, we correct it. The simplicity of the statement carried weight, because it was no longer about undoing what had happened. It was about what came next. Alicia stepped back up onto her porch, the wood beneath her feet solid and familiar, her home no longer surrounded, no longer under pressure, but standing exactly as it had before. And as the officers continued their work, tracing signals, confirming data, shifting from enforcement to investigation, the scene transformed completely, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, undeniable arrival of truth and the responsibility that followed it. The last of the radios went quiet not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already settled into place. One by one the patrol car lights dimmed and shut off, the red and blue reflections disappearing from the windows of Alicia's home and leaving behind only the soft gold of early morning. The street that had felt tight and controlled began to open again, doors closing gently, engines turning over not in urgency, but in departure. Officer Briggs stood for a moment longer at the base of the porch as if measuring the distance between where he had started and where he now stood, the difference not in feet, but in understanding. He looked up at Alicia, his expression no longer guarded, no longer certain, but honest in a way that carried more weight than authority ever had. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, the formality now grounded in respect. "This should have been handled differently." Alicia met his gaze, her posture steady, her voice calm. "It will be next time," she replied, not offering blame, not offering comfort, just a simple line that left space for accountability without needing to force it. Briggs nodded once, accepting that space, then turned to his officers, giving short, clear instructions that carried no tension, only direction. Vehicles began to pull away from the curb one after another, tires rolling slowly over the asphalt, the sound fading as each unit exited the street. Neighbors who had been watching from behind curtains now stepped back into their homes, the moment dissolving into the quiet rhythm of a normal morning. Commander Marcus Reed remained where he was for a second longer, his eyes scanning the now clearing street, confirming not just that the situation had ended, but that it had resolved the way it needed to. Then he looked toward Alicia, their eyes meeting again, and in that brief exchange there was no need for explanation, no need for acknowledgement, only a shared understanding that what had happened here mattered beyond this single moment. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then turned and walked back toward the dark SUV, the door closing with a soft, solid sound, the engine starting smoothly before the vehicle pulled away without drawing attention, blending into the distance as if it had never needed to arrive loudly in the first place. Alicia stood on her porch as the last patrol car turned the corner and disappeared from view, the street settling into silence, real silence this time, not the kind filled with waiting, but the kind that follows resolution. She took a slow breath, the air warmer now, carrying the quiet sounds of morning beginning again somewhere beyond her yard, a bird calling from a nearby tree, the faint hum of a passing car in the distance. She turned slightly, her hand resting once more on the doorframe, feeling the familiar texture beneath her fingertips, unchanged, steady, real. Then she stepped back inside her home, the door closing gently behind her. No slam, no rush, just a soft click that marked the end of something that had started without warning and ended without noise. Outside, the light continued to rise, filling the street with a calm that no longer needed to be earned. And for the first time since the flashing lights had cut through the